So yeah, my name is Nina Wallace. I'm the Media and Outreach Manager at Densho. So I'll be here kind of moderating and hanging out with Naomi. But yeah, I just want to welcome everyone in. Thank you so much for joining us, spending I guess for folks on the Pacific Coast at least, your lunchtime hour with us. So Naomi's going to share some reflections and a kind of short presentation on her recent travels to Japan. So we'll hear from her in a moment. But yeah, just as a quick housekeeping note, we are recording this session. And yeah, I see we have a very active chat already, which I love to see. But yes, encourage folks to keep saying hi in the chat. And if you have any questions that come up, feel free to drop those in the chat or the Q&A box, and we'll do our best to answer as many of those as we can get to towards the end. So yeah, with that, Naomi, I will hand it over to you.
Oh, great. Thank you so much and welcome everyone. Thank you so much for folks spending the midday Pacific Coast time with me. I also see that one of my fellow delegates, Rob, is here with us as well. So um, he will also have his own take on my trip to Japan, and I'll sort of share a little bit about him as well. So, but it's so nice to see many kind of familiar names in the chat as well. So recently, I had an opportunity to be selected as one of 10 delegates for a program that sends Japanese American leaders to Japan. And so I thought that I would share a bit about the program briefly, a couple of highlights, but really as to how the trip for me helped to kind of clarify and shape what I wanted to envision at Densho. Um, could I adjust my camera upwards? Is that good? To kind of talk about how the trip sort of impacted my thinking and clarity of thinking around education at Densho. And so that's sort of the framing of my visit, my Japan trip in essence. So let me just share my screen and I'll kind of walk through. Sorry. Okay. All right, so I'll just do this part of it, and then we have a couple questions, and I think we have questions from the audience as well. So, in beginning, I'll just sort of provide a brief overview of what the program was, and then some highlights from my trip. All of it to sort of talk about what does this mean for Densho. So that's sort of the framing, and then kind of talk more specifically about impact on Densho's activities. So the project itself is funded or supported by the U.S.-Japan Council. It was founded in 2009 as a nonprofit by Japanese Americans. One of the founders is Irene Hirano Inoue, who is one of was the founding director of the Japanese American National Museum. Her husband, Senator Daniel Inoue, Norman Mineta, was also a big supporter of this project. The program itself was sort of developed to kind of create opportunities for Japanese Americans to kind of connected sort of I'm sorry, it's kind of I'm sorry, I'm having some uh, challenges there. For Japanese Americans to be able to learn more about Japan, in essence, one of the projects that the U.S.-Japan Council was involved in right after its founding was the Tohoku earthquake that hit Japan. They fundraised to send support to Japan after that earthquake that killed about 20,000 people. And so some ways that Japanese Americans have supported individuals living in Japan is a kind of an example of an early sort of way that they imagined what the potential of a nonprofit like this could be. Still has links to the Japanese American National Museum as well. Our orientation and where the delegates all first meet is housed at JANM, and we're given a tour of the permanent collection there, where we kind of go through the history of Japanese Americans in North America, starting with sort of early immigration and then into the incarceration history. I will then move on to the program itself is the Japanese American Leadership Delegation. And this is sort of happens once a year, and there's a selection of 10 Japanese Americans who are mid-career, who are already sort of serving in leadership positions and in service of their community across the United States. And so through the trip, we learn about Japan. We learn about business sector, government, nonprofit sector, cultural sort of activities as well, because I think I'm not the only one on the delegation that felt this way, but I really didn't know much about Japan. I had never lived there. I really had kind of minimal knowledge about Japan itself. And so in some ways it was sort of a way for many of us to learn about many different kind of facets of Japan and Japanese culture. And so since the program's been founded, there's been about 230 delegates that have had the opportunity to take this trip. So in my delegation is a group of tremendous individuals, really some of the most amazing Japanese Americans that I have met ever. It was a wonderful group of people. And so more specifically, there was Yo Kawanami, who is from Hawaii. He's a director of the Hawaiian Electric Company. Darren Mano is a city council member and an architect in Salt Lake City. Susan Miyagi McCormick from New York. She is involved with the Japan Culture NYC. She's a founder and editor-in-chief of a website. Derek Kenmotsu is in the Bay Area and works in sort of technology, emerging technologies, and with the Department of Defense. He's also a Green Beret, multi-generational military family who his family incarcerated in Amachi. Tomoko Hosaka Mulaney is based in Washington, D.C. With the U.S.-Japan Chamber of Commerce. Anna Ninoyu is an architect in Chicago she was raised in Alaska and kind of has interesting perspective on the Japanese American community in Alaska. Rob Ono, I saw your name here. He's the tall gentleman in the very back. Wonderful person who's the president and CEO of the Annika Foundation, which is a organization that supports young women who are in the area of golf. It's sort of founded by Annika Sorensen, who's a professional golfer. George Tanaka is based in Los Angeles. He's a managing director of US Bank, but also is on the board of directors for Go for Broke and quite involved in the LA community. And then finally, David Yoshimura is from Des Moines, Iowa. And so he was the first delegate ever to represent that region. He's a lawyer and a partner at a law firm there. And so some highlights from our trip, really, we had a million meetings, essentially, was what it felt like. We met many, many different people. We first started our trip in Osaka, and 5 of the participants, including Rob, Tomoko, Darren, Anna, and then Susan, were involved in a symposium that was sponsored by the Japan Foundation. It kind of was a public sort of audience to kind of talk about culture, sports, and community from this sort of Japanese American perspective. We were also had an opportunity to meet with the conveners, the organizers of the Osaka Expo. The World's Fair is returning to Osaka, and so we just had opportunity to hear about what was happening, the process of that, the thinking around the themes, some of which was around sustainability. The build of the Osaka Expo, it's on this kind of island off of Osaka, and it's a temporary build for purposes of the expo. And so our fellow delegate Yo Kawanami, who's from Hawaii, suggested that if they might consider the usage of that timber when the expo comes down to help the rebuild of Maui following their fires. And then we also met with the mayor of Shibuya in Tokyo, and This is the area that has some of the most progressive sort of social policies in Japan. It was quite exciting to kind of hear about sort of how he thinks of the evolution of or potential evolution of Japanese culture. Shibuya is was the first ward to allow for same-sex marriage, and kind of talked just sort of about what his aims were for that area. Another personal moment for me that I found incredibly moving was that we were given a private tour of the Meiji Jungu Shrine, which is a large Shinto shrine in the middle of Tokyo. And so you go from very bustling city into this sort of forested, beautiful kind of area, and had a real opportunity to sort of have a moment to reflect. And I felt a real kind of sense of connection with my fellow delegates as well. Another personal moment for me that I found incredibly moving was that we were given a private tour of the Meiji Jungu Shrine, which is a large Shinto shrine in the middle of Tokyo. And so you go from very bustling city into this sort of forested, beautiful kind of area, and had a real opportunity to sort of have a moment to reflect. And I felt a real kind of sense of connection with my fellow delegates as well. Another highlight is that we met Princess Takamaro from the imperial family. Her late husband was of the imperial family, and I believe she was a commoner. She lived for some time as a child in England and studied at the University of Cambridge. Was absolutely a delightful, wonderful diplomat, and made time to kind of connect with each one of us individually during her brief visit with us. And so she was quite a global kind of open-minded thinker. I believe her and her late husband were the most well-traveled members of the imperial family ever. And she had a lot of kind of conversations about Japanese Americans and the role we can play. And then another highlight was that we had a chance to be able to meet with the Prime Minister Kishida. Two of the delegates were asked to be able to make remarks, quite short, and then they were consecutive translation as well happened. And so during this time, I was selected as one of the delegates, and my fellow delegate, Yo Kawanami, also spoke. And he talked more about this project that he's helped to develop, which is to take students, young people from Maui to Tohoku region, which he just completed the first so that young people from Maui would have an opportunity to meet folks who were youth in Tohoku at the time, but now are young adults, and feel a sense of healing and hope for rebuilding. And so during the time that this program started, students from Tohoku actually came and visited Hawaii as well. So he spoke to this, and I used my time as an opportunity to talk about Densho and to talk about history and talk about the importance of, as a Japanese American person, my father is an atomic bomb survivor from Hiroshima. And so my own family has a different story that we learn about World War II that is not the same as what was reflected in my American public school classroom. When I learned about World War II was quite different. And so then this sort of piqued in me at an earlier time why it's important to tell fuller stories about the past. And I think that this is what Densho aims to do, is really kind of share the rich diversity of experiences and stories that are within the community, and then also within the incarceration experience and within the World War II experience more broadly. And so this is also a way that I used my opportunity to be in front of him to sort of talk about why it's so important that we kind of learn more about each other, but also to tell fuller, more complex stories about the past, rather than sort of carefully sort of curated stories that often get used for nation building, for other efforts, but that sort of loses its sense of humanity and how we kind of connected stories. And that's to me was an important point as I tried to shape what I wanted to say. I even felt further strengthened in why I think what we do at Densho is so important. And so this moment for me was just gratifying for me that it sort of also started to clarify some thinking I was having around what I imagined for the future of Densho in the next few years. Another highlight that I enjoyed was we were able to meet with other Japanese Americans who are living and working in Japan. And so many of them are in kind of leadership positions in nonprofit sector, in private sector, and have had kind of unique sort of different experiences living and working in Japan and being able to kind of connect with people who then have this other vantage point. And I had a chance to meet with a few Japanese Americans who are based there who really offered wonderful sort of mentorship or advice and things that related to my work as a nonprofit leader. And then upon my return, what I really have felt the most wonderful part of the trip too is that the Pacific Northwest alumni of the people that have been selected into this program is incredibly welcoming and very sort of active in the Northwest Japanese American community space. And so the alumni network, they had dinner for me before my trip. And then when I came back, they had a welcome dinner for me as well. And and I am the 20th delegate that has been selected from Seattle to be part of this program. And so had this wonderful opportunity to now be part of this amazing club of people that also includes Tom Ikeda, who actually wrote my support letter for the program. And then Lori Matsukawa, our current Seattle mayor, Bruce Harrell, Judge Patrick Oishi, Lori Matsukawa, et cetera. There's just so many people that really are leaders within the Pacific Northwest Japanese American community that have had an opportunity to also be part of this experience. And since then, kind of thinking about the fact that we all have this shared experience, how can we further support and strengthen the sort of Japanese American organizations that are in the Pacific Northwest? And so this is some other part of it that was just undeniably a wonderful sort of rich reward for being part of this project. And so in thinking of to talk about this program as a way to update folks on and what I'm thinking about Densho in the next few years is that it really had huge impacts on how I thought about what we'll be doing next. And really kind of grounded in that is that the best part of the trip, and I would say for many of the alumni of this program, is that you meet 9 other Japanese Americans for whom you become friends, and that we support one another both personally, but also very professionally. And we are very kind of committed to being supportive of one another and celebrate each other's successes. We had an opportunity to this week that we were together. It was from morning to night. And our group was particularly very authentic with one another, very genuine, very supportive. And we were very vulnerable and talked about kind of challenges we face around identity or with family or raising children or all these sort of things that are part of this experience of being Japanese American. And for me, the best kind of part of this project was being in community now with these 9 other Japanese Americans who are living and working in very disparate areas across the country. And so very naturally then potential kind of partnerships have bubbled up in ways that Densho can kind of be present in regions. And so even just through the relationships I developed with the other delegates already, having some activity in the Midwest region where now I will be making a few trips out that way to be involved with some of the JACL communities there. And then also have more activity of Densho so that we can be available, accessible, and more present in some of these Midwest regions. And then a delegate in New York, where we were thinking about having an in-person town hall and an oral history project, maybe with Tom Ikeda as well. And then have been talking with Yo Kawanami, the Hawaiian delegate, about Densho coming out to Hawaii as well and having opportunities for us to maybe do an in-person town hall in Hawaii. And then through the delegation, a couple of the delegates have familial connections to the incarceration story. And so for one of the delegates, we will be now interviewing his dad, partly because of the way that our relationship evolved during this participation in the program. Tom Ikeda and I will be headed down to the Bay Area to get an oral history from one of the delegates' fathers. And so some of these things are kind of the ways that we think about how this program and my participation in the program is helping me kind of think about ways that we can be a bit more present in some of these other communities outside of Seattle. And then another area is that we received some funding to update the Japanese language version of Densho. And by being in Japan, I was able to meet a few other people who are living and working as scholars in Japan, interested in Japanese American history. And so as we sort of have an opportunity to update our Japanese language version of our website, that we would be able to actually get feedback from people in Japan about what Japanese audiences are particularly interested to learn about pertaining the incarceration history or early immigration. And so this, I think, further sort of strengthens the kind of research we're doing in the areas that I feel like are a bit under researched. So we still have many objects in our collections that are in Japanese that have not yet been translated. We've received some funding to translate some of these materials, but a lot of the sort of Issei experience, their lived experiences, because of the language barrier, is still sort of this under sort of researched area that I think that we have opportunity to, by having a channel to scholars living and working in Japan who might be able to support with the translation of these materials, either sort of further sort of expands the kind of history that we're able to support through our digital archives. And then what really at the end of it all that I found was so tremendously rewarding at the end of it is that the first year following Tom Ikeda as a founding executive director was really tough. I had a tough, I'd been working nonstop for about a year and a half. And having an opportunity to just sort of be plucked out of this, have an opportunity to be surrounded with very supportive Japanese American leaders who offered real counsel, support, advice, and energy. I felt energized coming back home. And it clarified for me when I kept meeting people in Japan, they don't know Densho. And so I would sort of have to explain what it was that we did and explain like why what we did was important. And by doing this over and over and over again, I started to get more clarity on what I thought we should be doing next. And so I came back from the trip so energized to kind of come back to do more with what we do at Densho. And the area that I know that many of our supporters have wanted to see is real activities and initiatives that focus on education. And so that is exactly sort of where I started to think about where we would try to resource. So one area is kind of making our materials more accessible, particularly to targeted audiences. So navigating a repository or encyclopedia as a high school student or as a teacher, or what are some of the needs that they might have? And then how can we kind of have these sort of collaborations with people that might be able to provide that sort of feedback for us. And so I am just starting to launch an educational advisory board or committee in which I've invited some educators to really support and help me shape this newly sort of formed department, which is what I'm trying to kind of create at Densho, and that we would be able to focus on and lean on our expertise. Densho has been around for almost 30 years, and we have now become the most comprehensive resource on the wartime incarceration that's available online. I know that most, or if not all, new scholarship that relates to incarceration history references Densho somehow, or Brian Nia, or has used some of our materials. And so we have become really a trusted resource in this area. And I really would like us to be able to start articulating Densho's best practices for teaching about this history. What have we learned? What is it about our 30 years of experience that we might be able to kind of deploy and share with others that either teach about this particular history, but even further difficult history, people that also kind of want to extend their history teaching to be able to kind of utilize lived experience like our rich oral history collection, our primary sources, and the sort of the resources we have in our digital archives. And then really kind of thinking about how we measure success and articulating, is it a reach of teachers? What is it that we would like to do is something that I'm focusing on, thinking about what success for Densho education might look like in the next 3 to 5 years. And then also engage with like big ideas. So rather than saying we want young people to know specific dates or numbers, but why does this particular past matter? How does the historic events, some sort of traumatic event, leave sort of legacies? How do they impact generations afterwards? What is it about redress in the Japanese American case as an interesting case study on reconciliation? And so there's these other ways that we can approach history education through the Japanese American story that might have other sort of tentacles into other stories and histories, but support educators along the way. And so that is kind of the main thrust of my presentation, is to just sort of share how this opportunity that I had through this delegation program has now really reinforced in me the relevance and importance of Densho's work into the future, and that this real sort of evolution of Densho moving into more of an explicit education space is what this trip really kind of, in essence, meant for me. And so with that, I think I'm going to pivot back to Nina.
To come off mute. Thank you so much, Naomi, for sharing all of that. Yeah, so I'll kind of guide us into this next like question and answer portion. I mean, to kick us off, I know you just shared some kind of overview highlights of the trip, and we had kind of joked as we were planning this event that, it's kind of like when you go on a big trip and then you come back home and you have to like show all the
Slideshow.
pictures and like all the highlights to the family because everybody wants to know, what did you go, what did you see, what did you eat? But I would love to hear a little more. If you can share kind of like what was a personal highlight for, like you as Naomi, as a human, as a Japanese American going to Japan. Yeah, like what stands out as kind of a personal highlight and, what energized you, what inspired you. Yeah.
It was interesting. This was my first trip to Japan that had nothing to do with my family. And so it was a very different way that I entered the country, and a different kind of people that weren't extended family or relatives or anything like that. And it wasn't about family. It was just sort of learning about this country that I realized I didn't know that much about. I um, sort of thinking about how when Japanese Americans go to Japan, you feel super Japanese American. Like while you're there, you sort of feel your Japanese Americanness more than anything. That's sort of what I felt. And to have the opportunity to do that with 9 other Japanese Americans and be in a space in a community and traveling together and having an opportunity to have that funny, like, experience where sometimes people might make assumptions that we were from Japan or talk to us as if we were Japanese, even though we're very American. But then also seeing how there are aspects of our heritage or food tastes or funny things that we carry with us in our families that are connected to Japan, and that also in the Japanese American community, there's been just so much shame around connection to heritage and the desire to acculturate and be super American is also part of the Japanese American kind of experience. And if Densho is able to kind of provide just an open channel to Japan, whether that's through our new kind of soft launch Koseki retrieval program, where I think if you're 5 generations here, like it's really difficult to even imagine how you would deal with a bureaucratic kind of nature of Japanese government to access your ancestral records. And so I feel like that's one way that we might be able to kind of open a door or to sort of find out which prefectures and stuff that many Japanese Americans are from, or which kind of telling that first kind of early immigration story to learn more about the first immigrants' kind of experience by translating those materials to kind of more make the history more expansive. And so when I win, I also just realized that I myself also had many moments in my life where I was ashamed of my heritage and how I looked, or that I wanted to not eat my Japanese food and not speak the language. And now kind of coming into a different sort of relationship with my heritage that feels a little more complicated, and trying to figure out how I want my daughter to feel connected or engaged. And so only very recently, I took her for the very first time to Japan and sort of kicked myself that I wish I had done it much earlier in her life, but am still figuring it out in some ways, but that I would love it if there's ways that Densho as a resource can help other Japanese Americans kind of have a bit of an open channel to their heritage and to their sort of history that goes further back than first immigration.
Yeah, no, I think that I feel like yeah, since you've been back, I've heard you share a lot about kind of that retracing those ties that were like very abruptly cut
Yeah.
off by the war. So yeah, it's really powerful to hear about that. Yeah, I want to encourage folks at this point. So we did kind of solicit some questions as people were registering for this event. So I'll be pulling from some of those questions that people sent in ahead of time. But yeah, if folks have any questions for Naomi, would love to invite those in either the chat or the Q&A. Um, so please keep sending them in. Yeah, I mean, I think kind of related to the sort of highlights and kind of takeaways from this trip. I guess one thing I'm wondering about is, you shared what the kind of reflections and like what you're thinking about since then, but I'm curious what questions it raised for you, like as you're returning home and kind of reflecting on how this relates to Densho's work, your own work, kind of what's coming in the future. So yeah, what questions did it raise for you?
Or like not so much a question, but a thought or realization that I think more of us at Densho also need to realize is that we are often in an echo chamber. And so those of us who live and work in at Densho is that we go dive deep into the history. And so some of the basic information stuff is kind of, we don't even surface that in as much anymore. And so having opportunities to just even kind of talk about like, yes, this happened. Here's some sort of reasons why people are forcibly incarcerated. Just going back to kind of the basic story and making sure that that information is more readily available on our website. And then also that we support others who kind of work, particularly like I was talking to Kimiko Mar at JAMP about how Densho can support just with basic information about some of the campsites that when we are sort of in this sort of echo chamber space of being too dive deep, I also often forget some people don't barely know very much at all about this history, and that I kind of need to also keep going back to from surface to deep water and need to have those moments where I kind of exercise that. And then also with how thinking about the regional stuff with the Midwest and sort of East Coast is that in the West Coast, we have a pretty robust network of Japanese American community organizations that we partner with and support, and we know each other, and a lot of the executive directors know each other and can kind of find natural ways that we collaborate. But there's also so many other JA orgs that kind of quietly are working in spaces where there aren't a large population. And so even when David, who was the delegate from Des Moines, Iowa, he was like, yes, there's some Japanese Americans from Iowa. And, and just sort of thinking about some of the communities that don't have the sort of rich networks that I think Densho's so privileged to be housed in Seattle and be able to kind of partner with these other organizations. And so that's why I sort of was thinking, okay, we need to also just think uh, sort of go back to kind of basic stuff too, like who needs our resources, like who needs our help to even getting some of this history out as an early introduction. Even though like a lot of what we do real more like deep dives, and we kind of are interested in under sort of not surface stories and making more and more our collections more and more diverse, and that's been kind of our mandate, I think, at our at the staff level. I think we have a real focus and interest in that, and many of us know the history so well and think about it and at a very deep level, but a good exercise for us to kind of keep going back and forth towards like, well, there's people that actually don't know anything at all about this history, and that's always surprising. I always find that where I'm like, oh my goodness, I live in a very different space than you, and so then getting better at that pitch, like how I tell that story and why that history should matter to someone today.
Yeah, no, kind of creating multiple entry points
Mhm.
to the history. Yeah, I appreciate that. Yeah, no, as you were talking about, it's like one, question that we'd received was kind of asking about, if you could talk more about, these partnerships that you're building with Japan, and I think also you kind of mentioned in your presentation with, the other delegates on this trip of, folks in the Midwest, on the East Coast, in Hawaii, other places, and so yeah, I wonder if you could, share a little more about kind of those partnerships and why you think it's important for Densho to expand to these places.
Yeah, I think I spoke a little bit to that in my earlier sort of response. It's just that there are many communities where there is rich sort of Japanese American history, but not a lot of kind of maybe an organization or sort of a museum there or something where maybe they just don't have as many resources as we do on the West Coast states. And so that was one of my thinking as a digital archives. We have the ability to be able to kind of be a great resource for any partner across the country, but we just have to know that we're sort of open to those kinds of partnerships, that we would like to be engaged in conversations with folks outside of the West Coast, and that is actually requires us to go out there. We have to kind of get to know people who are living and working in those spaces and let them know about what we have to offer, and that we're kind of really open to engaging with them and collaborating with them. And so that's one sort of piece of why I think we're just sort of talking about being present in some other regions.
Yeah. Let's see. We have another question from Rob Ono who asks, was there anything that surprised you about Japan after this particular trip? And separately, what makes Japan so special if someone asks you who hasn't visited?
Oh dear, Rob. So Rob is one of the delegates. Rob Ono was our um, cool jock older brother of the delegate, a former hockey player. So thanks, Rob. So I think Japan is so surprising to me in some ways because they're incredibly advanced in some ways where they have. We were able to go to see I think it's like a team lab kind of. They do sort of this usage of technology to create these kind of immersive artistic experiences, but they have this whole kind of cityscape of Tokyo that you can sort of see. It's in this massive kind of warehouse room, and then it sort of changes and lights up, kind of shows receding ocean lines, and like it's just a fascinating kind of technologically like interesting experiment. So they do things like that, but then they also like for some paperwork things, it's so old fashioned where they require you to have your Hanko stamp for things, or that difference seemed very fascinating, where it's like so entrenched in kind of older sort of ways in some ways, and then also um, incredibly modern in other ways. And so that difference was striking. And I think that's also partly why the trip to the temple in the middle of Tokyo was like that, where it's like you're in one of the busiest, bustling kind of metropolitan areas ever. And then you're suddenly in this like very quiet, shockingly quiet, forested area that is just right in the middle of the city. So that sort of those things, I kept having moments where I'm like, oh, that's so strange. Like it's very, they seem kind of like polar opposite type of positions of like super sort of movement and emerging technology, all these things into something that felt like it's very like hundreds and hundreds of years ago kind of moments where you could sort of imagine it was very much the same at that time or something like that. And so I found that to be an interesting observation. And I would say that that's also something that I think would be special for someone who'd never been there, that you could sort of see both things in the same place, that you could kind of have that opportunity to see some countries that kind of are locked into some older heritage and traditions and ways of being, while simultaneously there's this other part of society that's really pulling to doing things that you just haven't seen before. There's some things there that they have that are just so using technology in ways that really advance or improve people's day-to-day lives kind of things with just, their toilets and, those kinds of things. There's day-to-day things that are funny, but then also they have very interesting sort of artistic and architectural sort of um, future sort of movements there too that are really kind of exciting to see.
Yeah, no, I think that like those juxtapositions are really interesting. Yeah, it's been like almost 10 years since I was in Japan. I did my like ancestor trip with my brother, and I still dream about the toilets and the ofuro and like the house, all of that. Yeah, we have another question from Jean Kanamori, who asks if we have any plans for, future collaboration with the U.S.-Japan Council.
Yeah, so as a JALD delegate, I'm a member this year for USJC. What's interesting is that they have now a new president who just started, Audrey Yamamoto. She was also a participant of the JALD program a year before. And I think someone who has been part of this very strange, unique, once in a lifetime kind of experience being at the helm of it, she's like, I think Yonsei, I believe. That perspective that she might bring to USJC, I'm excited to see that it's sort of through the lens of a Japanese American and how Japanese Americans can play a role at USJC, I think is something that I'm intrigued to sort of see what happens there. But I was already with alongside our archivist director Caitlin Oyekun, we presented at the USJC's Under 40 Summit. So they have kind of a leadership summit for folks who are under 40, and happened to be in Seattle last week. And so we presented about kind of Pacific Northwest Coast Japanese American history. And at the top of it, the audience was sort of asked about how many people know about JA history. It was very like few. And so then that also is this other reminder to me, like, we got to like really think about kind of the back to basic audiences, that we need to be able to tell these stories to people that surprising. I mean, it's like a room full of Japanese Americans, and there's only like a few hands that kind of knew somewhat about Japanese American history. And so I found that to be striking and a place for us to be a good educational resource on the history.
Yeah. Let's see, there's another question that we had that's, I think, Natasha, our communications director, who's in the chat, can maybe give a more detailed response to this about the specific artist in residence program. But someone was asking whether Densho is going to have our artist in residence program this year. And so I wonder for you, Naomi, if kind of building on that question, maybe if we can share a little bit about how your time in Japan and, kind of the reflections that you're bringing back, like how you're thinking about kind of retooling or expanding, maybe not specifically the artist in residence program, but, just in general, some of those kind of core Densho programs that we have.
Yeah, I think being part of kind of a leadership program for me really then kind of drives home the importance of mentoring future leaders working in this space. And so my roots are from being a teacher and working in youth development. And so thinking though now in my current position and stage of life of how we can do a bit more proactively around thinking about future leaders that will come to lead Densho into the future, and how do we support them now? How do we kind of create a pipeline of strong Japanese American leaders to support these amazing Japanese American organizations that exist today is also this other thing that has been at the top of my mind because I had a chance to meet a lot of Japanese Americans during the trip and then post the trip that really offered to extend their hand to support me in my work. And I want to kind of do the same for someone who's sort of emerging in sort of nonprofit leadership space, that same sort of generosity and kind of sense of community, that it's not kind of a sort of a powered sort of issue or something like that, where I really authentically would like to see a great pipeline of Japanese Americans who could move into the archive space at Densho, move into technology, could become, the next Brian Nia, the next executive director of Densho and Janum and so forth. And so how do we let them know that we're sort of here and available to try to kind of lift them up along the way? That's something that I think about as something that I want to see as sort of trickled throughout what we do. This sort of it's in our name, right? So it's kind of this idea that we do that through all of the ways that we engage. And then something like the artist in residence, I've been toying with something that supports emerging scholars that kind of help to kind of enhance our understanding of Japanese American history. What's some way that we might be able to provide an outlet for emerging scholars to be able to come in front of Greg Robinson or Brian Nia, or we're sort of already sort of great scholars in this area, and be able to kind of talk and pitch about their PhD project or something like that. Like that would also be such a wonderful opportunity, and maybe something that we should be figuring out how we might be able to offer that as a support for some of the emerging scholars in this space. So kind of that same theme, like I'm kind of that's threaded throughout like all of what I'm excited about right now. It's definitely like next generation kind of engagement.
Yeah, no, that's really great. Yeah, I mean, there's another question that I think speaks a lot to what you were just saying. So you may have already just answered this, but Dan Shimizu is asking what initiatives you see in progress or in the future to kind of pull younger generations into Densho, like folks who are college age or younger. Um, so yeah, I don't know, you may have already answered that, but if you have anything else to say, yeah, I think it's a great question from Dan.
Yeah, we have so we've been collaborating with UCLA's Asian American Studies program and their multimedia Asian American textbook. So Densho has contributed a chapter on the wartime incarceration as part of that. And so that textbook project will likely have a much broader reach that would be able to kind of reach classrooms in a way that we wouldn't be able to otherwise on our own. And so that kind of collaboration, I think, is the way I think that we can reach younger audiences through Densho by kind of thinking about who we should be working with and collaborating with. And so recently, I was at the Asian American Studies Conference that was also in Seattle last week, and had dinner with Samit Malik from the South Asian American Digital Archive, SADA, of other ways that like we could intentionally kind of start kind of building community archives of these sort of APA kind of communities that in the realm of education, or teacher workshops or something like that, that we might be able to kind of do joint programming to reach similar audiences that we want to, but do it through like 3 or 4 different community stories or something like that. And so that's this other thing that I've been working on of identifying and thinking about the kinds of institutional partners that we should be engaged in doing joint sort of educational efforts or developing teacher workshops or curriculum, kind of those kinds of things together in collaboration with others is also this other area to then reach a broader, younger audience.
Yeah, thank you. Um, let's see. We have another question. We're getting some good questions in. So we have another question from Setsuko asking, is Densho going to increase their presence in the Northeast? As a post-war Japanese American who grew up going to Japan and knows Japan very well, what we don't learn at all is in the American Northwest is the history of how Japanese fit into the overall Asian American history. And we're still seen as immigrants, in quotes, especially in Massachusetts, in the Northeast. So yeah, I guess there's maybe a couple questions in there of, is Densho going to increase our presence in the Northeast? And, maybe also some of your thoughts on kind of expanding our understanding and education of how Japanese Americans fit into that larger umbrella of Asian American history.
Mhm. Yeah, I think there's a different facets of that question, so I'm probably gonna lose a part. But I was just having a conversation. I was at the benefit for JANM in Los Angeles recently, and was talking to Catherine Banai, who was a lead counsel in the Hirabayashi case. She now lives in New York, and so she was also observing and kind of thinking about this sort of community of post-war Japanese Americans who don't know as much about the JA history in the same way that West Coast post-war Japanese Americans kind of know about. It's like a little bit of a different um, access to that information, and it's not even, and she also sort of mentioned that it's not as large of a community. But so she and I were saying we should meet to kind of brainstorm and think about ways that maybe Densho could kind of engage in the sort of post-war JA communities, kind of learning about sort of JA history 1800s and on. So have just actually been thinking about what that could look like. And so Tom Akeda and I were also saying that there's an opportunity for us to maybe do a little bit of a meet and greet out in the Northeast at some point, either later this year. I think I missed a part of your question, but
I think there was kind of a second piece in there around how Japanese Americans fit into kind of this larger category of Asian American history. Um, so yeah, I guess what wish that people knew or like hope that we can do more education around like how Japanese fit into that history.
yeah, there's efforts, I think, as so these identities kind of or how people identify evolve. I think for a very long time, I identified as Asian American more so than just Japanese American because of the kinds of other friends that I had that were, Chinese American or Korean American or Filipina, and so that felt like this inclusive way that I identified myself. Being much more entrenched now in Japanese American community at the moment, connected to my JA history, though, thinking about how we bridge and enter conversations around kind of broader APAI history is with the textbook project, I think is a foray for us to explore that expansion. I think my involvement in the early conversations around maybe a national museum at Smithsonian Museum, that's a question that kind of comes up as well. It's like, how do we kind of encompass these many very diverse sort of groups and very different histories and different experiences under one umbrella is a huge challenge. And so what are the ways that we intersect as a community is the way that that initial steering committee is engaged in that conversation. What are the places in which we sort of intersect? And so that is something that is going to be something that I think Densho will have as an active kind of area that we'll be moving towards, I imagine.
Yeah. Let's see, I think we have time for maybe a couple more questions. So we have one question from Stan Chikuma, and you kind of shared in your presentation how Densho is interested in looking deeper into the Issei experience. So Stan is asking if there's also interest in the Kibe experience, since much of those materials are also, in Japanese, but also very relevant to understanding the World War II experience and the divisions within the JA community.
Yeah, well, thanks, Stan, and I owe you an email. So, but thanks for that great question. This is 100% something that's so interesting to me, and I think interesting to many staff members at Densho. Currently, I have working on getting a diary from someone back east of a Japanese in Japan during she's Japanese American, but sort of a Japanese American kind of experience in Japan during the war. And so it's been, I think, the barrier has been the language. And so that we now have a full-time staff member who's able to do some translation. But because some of the language is older, we've needed to expand the kinds of scholars that we could work with that would be able to support the translation and contextualization of those materials of that time period. And that's been part of what Brian and I have been doing is kind of thinking about who's working in this space, who's working maybe primarily in Japan, but interested in the diaspora, and that these people could really be a great resource for us to help us identify these stories. I also heard from someone about different kind of monument memorial projects, like really small little plaques and things in Japan of Japanese Americans who were never came back home essentially and died, or that there's some, or maybe died during the war, and that they're in this town. Or I've heard that there's this sort of little monument to a couple of Japanese Americans who lived there for some time and then went back home. And so there's like a whole unearthed sort of area, I think, of fascinating history that I would really be keen to, and I'm hoping that by having a bit more activity around the Japanese language might be a way that activates our ability to be able to translate some of these materials and make them available, and have that story kind of Jay's history be told.
Yeah, no, I think that's really important. Yeah, no, I mean, I think there's, I'm still seeing a few questions coming in, and I'm not sure that we have time for more of them, but want to let folks know we will be saving the chat, saving the questions. So there are definitely yeah, a lot of really great questions and things for us to reflect on moving forward. So to kind of transition us towards the close of our time together, one more last question that I wanted to ask you, Naomi, is, as you're kind of reflecting on this trip and kind of what you want to bring back with you to Densho, what's a guiding intention that you have as you return, as you're kind of looking at the next, 3, 5, 10, however many years of Densho?
Yeah, I think I often talk with Tom Ikeda, who has become a great mentor to me, but about how I think the chapter under Tom Ikeda was to kind of collect the stories, preserve the stories, ensure the stories are not forgotten or lost, and that it was to kind of build the platform and build the archives, and that this next evolution is just sort of this refocus on making sure that Densho is also viewed as like a history education organization. Like, how can we sort of use sort of the fact that over the last almost 30 years become this incredible resource and a very well trusted resource on this history, and ensure that many people use it, make use of the materials that we've collected, make use of the oral histories. I have, every time I'm asked to kind of talk or present, I go back and I watch some of the oral histories. I'll go through our DDR and unearth some story, a little thing that someone said that's so moving, and that then it sort of reminds me like we need more people to know these things exist, that they're very useful as teaching resources or even for one's own understanding around your own history or identity. I mean, there's many ways that people can engage with our materials, but we do also need to make it so that the materials are easier to access at different sort of access points, right? So if you don't know anything about J history, some of our stuff can feel very overwhelming because you wouldn't even know how to kind of make an entry into it. So I have been kind of thinking about how we can sort of have different ways people engage with our online resources, because if you are already a scholar or a journalist, or you're already someone that dives deep, so you can kind of sort of jump right into our materials and sort of find what you need to find. But if you're someone that really doesn't, I was talking to someone and they about their family, and they didn't know what a FAR record was. And so even just sort of talking about their own family sort of genealogy, the kind of their own desire to unearth their own family history, I forget that I'm like, oh, okay, like they don't know where we get our data from or what kind of records we draw our understanding of history on. And so we need to be better at letting people know if they don't know it, how should we relay this information so that then they can tap into either, further into the rabbit hole that is our collections.
Yeah, thank you so much, Naomi. Yeah, and thank you for, sharing all of these reflections, taking the time to, I know you have for folks outside of Densho, I don't think people know just how busy Naomi is. So really appreciate you taking some time to like connect with all of us. And I think we all really appreciate being able to, hear directly from you about the trip and see the photos, have the like family picture share.
I didn't share any of the food. It's like
So we'll have a separate town hall for that. But yeah, with that, I want to bring up our another Densho community member, family member person, Christina Kata, is going to share a little bit about some upcoming events, other opportunities to connect with Densho, and also ways to, kind of help support the work and the, future that we're trying to build here. So yeah, Christy, I'll pass it to you.
Oh, there we go. My mic was up above. Hi, everyone. I'm Christy Nakata. I'm a marketing manager here at Densho. And as Naomi mentioned about creating sustaining funding for all of these projects that we are working on at Densho, we're really excited to share about our new monthly giving program, the History Keepers Society. I'll plug that in the chat right now. So the um, making a monthly gift to Densho is um, the a really convenient way to an effective way to provide continual support to us. And your gift can be spread out through the year. So really small, affordable donations can make a really big long-term impact for us. So some of the benefits of becoming a History Keeper monthly donor will be the History Keepers Hour, which is quarterly virtual meetups with the Densho staff, kind of like this, and priority registration for all virtual and in-person events, monthly member features highlighting fellow history keepers, and special acknowledgement on our new founding member donor wall, virtual donor wall, sorry. Um, and right now, by joining the History Keeper Society as a founding member, your first monthly donation is going to be matched. So it's a really great time to consider adding a monthly gift to Densho. And I also, for those of you in the Seattle area, I want to give a quick plug for our upcoming in-person events in the area. So we have a book event with Satsuki Ina, the Japanese American Day of Remembrance event in Tacoma coming up, and also the book event with Frank Abe. So you can find information about all of those events coming up at the link that I've just dropped in the chat. So thank you so much, everybody, for joining us today.
thank you. Thanks, Christy. Thank you, everyone.